Thank you for joining us tonight for After Dark Online Fractals. My name is Kathleen McGuire, and I'm part of the team that puts together the Exploratorium's weekly After Dark Online programs. While tonight's program has been recorded remotely, I would like to acknowledge that the home of the Exploratorium at Pier 15 in San Francisco is located on unceded territory traditionally belonging to the Ramaytush Ohlone people. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and future, for their caretaking and shepherding of the land. For tonight's program, we'll be considering fractals from a span of perspectives: mathematical, artistic, psychological. We'll be learning about the many places fractals show up in nature, why they are useful, and also why we're attracted to them. We'll also learn how to make a couple of versions of fractals at home. But what exactly is a fractal? Now, this question is going to be answered several times over the course of this program. However, it seemed like a good starting place to get the answer might be from hearing from the person who coined the term, mathematician Benoit Mandelbulb. The Exploratorium was lucky to host Dr. Mandelbulb at our museum in 2001. I'm going to share with you a very brief segment from a longer webcast he participated in, where he shares what a fractal is and some places we can see them. And while the basics of what a fractal is haven't shifted too much in the last 20 years, the fidelity of video and audio has made some significant improvements. So I hope the quality isn't too distracting for this brief segment and that you can enjoy the answer.
Today we have the great privilege of having mathematician Professor Benoit Mandelbulb. Professor Mandelbulb is the discoverer of fractals. Does anybody here in the audience know what a fractal is? No? Can you tell us what a fractal is?
Well, a fractal, take one particular fractal, the cauliflower. If you look at the whole cauliflower, it's one big thing, but you see it's made of little florets, small pieces. If you cut each piece of the cauliflower and throw everything away, what you have is a small cauliflower. Then you take again a small piece of that, throw everything, and so on. So you see, a cauliflower is like something which is made of small things, just like the big thing, and no small things, and no small things, no small things. Look at the flower, at a cloud. A cloud, well, there's a big sort of round thing, and then there are bumps, and there are bumps and bumps, and bumps and bumps and bumps, etc., etc. So shapes like that are very, very important. Not only because what you see, but because many, many things in nature are like that.
So, does one find fractals in other places in nature besides the cauliflower? Can one find them in ice, for example?
Well, that's a big question. I want to ask them down there, up there.
Down there.
But here in a city like San Francisco, it's very difficult not to meet at the same time the smooth and the rough. So you look at the map of San Francisco, it's all straight. It's very simple, very regular. Well, not quite the Market Street, which is sort of off, but very regular. But if you look at the streets along them, very irregular. And before humans came and put those streets, it was even bumpier. Bumps and bumps and bumps and bumps and bumps. Starting a big bump like the whole city and ending on small bumps like a piece of, like a pebble. So almost everything in nature has some element of smoothness and some element of roughness. And so it is a big, big, big permanent continuing competition between the bumpy, the rough, and the smooth.
If you would like to hear more from that webcast, the full video is still available on the Exploratorium's website. Later on in tonight's program, we'll be sharing 2 short films as well as an introduction from the filmmaker and fractal artist Julius Horsthuis, and hearing from Kelly Robles, a doctoral candidate at the University of Oregon in the Department of Psychology, who studies how humans perceive fractals and why we are attracted to them. Up first, we'll hear from Alex Berke, who will expand on what fractals are, helping you understand them through trying your hand at drawing one. So I have my paper and my pen ready, and I hope you get yours ready as well. She'll be inviting you to draw along. She'll also explore other types of infinite patterns, sharing some animations that show how the rules of these patterns manifest. Alex Berke is currently a researcher and PhD candidate at the Media Lab at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She previously worked as a technologist, most recently as a software engineer at Google. She recently released her first book, Beautiful Symmetry, a coloring book about math that invites readers to engage with mathematical concepts visually through coloring challenges and visual puzzles. And you'll get to see a little preview of that book as well as the online manifestation of it in her talk. So here's Alex.
Thank you for that introduction. Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a technologist who is also interested in art. And I've also been long intrigued by the concept of infinity and different ways to understand it. And something I love about fractals is how they provide one more lens through which to perceive what infinity can mean. So fractals, they're infinitely complex or infinitely self-similar. And what I mean is that you can infinitely zoom in on a piece of a fractal and find a version of the larger form that you just zoomed past. This sounds pretty abstract, so let's draw. Right now, I'm working on drawing a simple fractal. And if you have paper and a pen nearby, I hope you'll join me. This is called the Sierpinski triangle. And what I like about the Sierpinski triangle is that it is easy to start drawing and can exemplify in a simple way what fractals are about. So Sierpinski triangles are made up of many triangles, and we start with just one. Then to make it into a fractal, we follow a rule, and we'll consider following it at different levels, or what I'll call levels. So grab your paper. I'm just coloring in this first triangle while you're grabbing your paper. And so each time we complete a level, we'll zoom in to complete the rule at the next level. So here's my messy drawing, and the interior shaded triangle is the one I'm focusing on. So let's call this our picture at level 1. Now here's the rule. At each level, we draw a new triangle at the side of every triangle we drew in the previous level. And I hope you'll draw with me. Here's what I mean. Remember, this shaded triangle was the triangle we drew at level 1. And now at level 2, we're drawing another triangle at each of its sides. This is messy because I'm going quickly. You'll probably do a much better job than I will. And all the new triangles we drew at level 2 are the same size. And by drawing them, we just created even more places that we'll need to draw triangles at the next level. And these, of course, will be smaller. So for this triangle, we'll have to draw one here, and here, and here. Now there are even more places to draw new, smaller triangles at the next level. And so each time we drew one triangle, we created 3 new places to draw a triangle at the next level. One of the things I like about Sierpinski triangles is that they very simply show this concept of recursive branching. So to complete the Sierpinski triangle, we would need to go on like this, infinitely repeating this rule with infinitely more triangles that get infinitely smaller at infinitely further levels. But we can't possibly do that. But if we extend our imagination to think about what this could look like, it provides a pretty vision of infinity. And about what we said about fractals being self-similar, we could zoom in. Here's my exterior. We could zoom in level by level, say focusing on the top branch. And at each level, we would see a version of the larger self. And since it has infinitely many levels, in theory, we could zoom in like this an infinite number of times. So we got here by following this rule infinitely, this really simple rule. But my drawing is a mess, and we didn't get very far on paper because I'm just a human. But computers are good at following rules like this because they can be programmed. What we just did on paper was to manually follow a simple recursive algorithm. I'm a programmer, and I made this web page to show this process. Here's our Sierpinski triangle, again, drawn to various levels by a computer program. So let's summarize. We can create infinitely complex fractals by following a very simple rule infinitely many times. In this way, fractals are a kind of infinitely repeating pattern. Now I want to tell you about other infinitely repeating patterns that might not have the same kind of complexity of fractals, but like fractals, they can help us with intuitions of infinity through another lens of illustration. I'm going to show you some infinitely repeating patterns with infinitely repeating symmetries. So again, I love how these simple ideas and illustrations can make some of the bigger and exciting ideas in math, like infinity and complexity, more accessible. So I created what I call a coloring book about math. It's a coloring book on paper, and all the content is also freely accessible online. And on paper, we color algorithmically drawn illustrations to interact with and explore the mathematical concepts behind infinitely repeating symmetries. And that's with puzzles that I call coloring challenges. But if these symmetries are hard to see on static paper, they come to life online where the illustrations are interactive and animated. Now I want to show you freeze patterns. Just like fractals, we can generate an infinitely repeating pattern by following a simple rule infinitely many times. These patterns are different though. They're not self-similar across scales. Instead, they simply repeat along a line. So here's the simplest one that you can, again, draw on paper if you prefer. And we can start with a simple shape. With our Sierpinski triangle, we started with a triangle. And here we can start with a curve. And this time, the rule to algorithmically generate the pattern is to copy and shift the shape over to redraw it again and again, infinitely many times, to generate this infinitely repeating pattern. Now, we need to, again, use imagination to see this pattern repeating infinitely beyond the borders of this web page and on both the left and right sides. So see this continuing onward to the right, to the left. And also, it doesn't matter what the starting design is. It could be this, one curve, it could be 2 curves, it could be 3 curves, it could be anything else. we can just focus on the rule that generated the repetition. And then we have the same kind of pattern. Okay, so we have this very simple pattern generation rule and process. And then we're left with a pattern that has symmetry. In this case, we have a very simple kind of symmetry translation that is a shift. So what I mean is, let's call each of these design pieces, like this one curve, a unit. And we could take the entire pattern that we end up with and shift it over by 1 unit so that each piece lands on an identical piece. Like this piece will land on this piece that was here will land on this piece. And since this is an infinitely repeating pattern, there will always be another piece behind to replace the piece that was shifted over and left a space to fill. So we could shift the entire pattern over. I want you to see this as a line, a pattern, and we shift the entire thing over. Each piece is shifting over, each of these infinitely many pieces. And so the thing is that we're left with the same pattern we had before. And so this transformation of shifting the entire pattern over, yet leaving it unchanged, is what we can call a symmetry. And here we're able to do this because our patterns are infinitely repeating. And it's a bit like how we were able to zoom in on our Sierpinski triangle fractal, an infinitely many scales, and see similar fractal image as before. Okay, this was a very simple pattern, and I want to show you another now. This time we'll generate a pattern by rotating a piece around a point and then translating or shifting it over infinitely many times. And again, this is an infinitely repeating pattern that repeats infinitely on either side beyond the borders of this web page. And again, we're focusing on the generation rule, not the design. It's the same kind of pattern as each of these. And what is neat here is that not only does our design repeat infinitely, but the symmetries do as well. So here's the point that we first rotated around. And just because of the simple rule that generated this pattern, we'll see that these points repeat infinitely along the pattern. Take just one of these points and see how we could say, stick a pin in the middle of this point and rotate the entire pattern around that point. So see how this piece would land on this piece. This piece would land on this piece. And we could see how each piece would land on an identical piece. And this is the same for each of these rotation points. And there are infinitely many of them. And I think it's pretty cool. And I want to show you so many more kinds of infinitely repeating patterns, like patterns with reflections and patterns where the generation rule combines more symmetries, and then patterns that are not limited to repeating along a line, but repeat along 2 dimensions, like these. And they're all in this coloring book. And the book is about better understanding symmetries and infinitely repeating patterns with math. And it uses coloring to interact with these patterns and destroy their symmetries. And I made this because I find these concepts and ways to explore symmetry through fractals and infinitely repeating patterns exciting. They're what led me to math. And these ideas can be so accessible through visuals and interactions. And the online version of this book is free to make it more accessible as well. So I hope you have fun with these ideas too, and that they can deepen your intuition of infinity. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I hope you'll all dig deeper into Alex's coloring book, Beautiful Symmetry, either by visiting the digital version of the book at beautifulsymmetry.onl or by checking out a physical copy. So Alex helped you play with drawing fractals. Before we move on to the next piece of the program, I wanted to share another way to create a fractal using one of the Exploratorium's science snacks. For this very simple experiment, You'll need 2 pieces of either glass or plastic. I have glass here, risking it, and also some enamel model paint, which I actually have acrylic paint, which worked as well. So maybe you have those things around the house and can grab them, or just enjoy this snack and get prepared for using it later. Here's the fractal I created. But now we'll move on to a much more expansive type of fractal creation and briefly hear from the filmmaker and fractal artist Julius Horsthuis before watching one of his short films called Emergence. Julius Horsthuis is a Dutch visual and fractal artist who combines his years of experience with visual effects and passion for computer graphics to create cinematic animations. With a background in film, his passion for fractal art and artificial intelligence allows him to be the creator of his own world. Julius works with the software Mandelbulb 3D, which he'll talk about a bit in his intro, to uncover iterative, complex formulas that are generated by the computer to produce unmeasurable structures that are fractals. You'll see that very clearly in the films. His new solo exhibition, Geometric Properties, recently opened at the Gallery Arch House in New York City. Here's Julius.
Hi, my name is Julius Horsthuis. I'm a fractal artist from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. And a little later, we're going to watch a fractal short film. I wanted to explain a little bit what fractals are and what fractal art is specifically, and how I got to be a fractal artist. Because I have no background in fractals or mathematics particularly. I have a background in filmmaking. I have been working on a film set for about 5 years, and after that I started to work in the visual effects industry, doing lots of CGI and visual effects, computer animation for various film and commercial things here in the Netherlands. But I've always wanted to do a little bit something more creative, and I always had these ideas in my head about film scenarios that would sort of play out in these very otherworldly, almost other dimensions or alien worlds. And I've always been looking out on different techniques in order to do that. And most of the techniques I've seen were not really interested. I wasn't very interested in it until this was back in 2010, I believe. I suddenly saw my first 3-dimensional fractal film. And before I talk about what a 3-dimensional fractal is, it's maybe good to talk about what fractals is in general. Fractals is, we have these, there are these, I would say, mathematical functions that create sort of very complex features in the real world. So you have a very simple formula that creates something extremely beautiful and complex that sort of looks like it's all connected, and it looks very, it's I sometimes call it the illusion of complexity. You could see something that is endlessly complex. You would think it will take a million years to draw or to sculpt or to make it, but it's actually just a very simple formula that can create all that complexity. And some nice real world examples of that are the leaves of a fern or a broccoli, but even the galaxy and the way our lungs are created, riverbeds. There's lots of real world complex things that are actually fractal based. And you have two-dimensional fractals, and you have this three-dimensional fractal. And the first one that they invented back in the early 2000s, or the late 2000s rather, was the Mandelbulb, and it's a three-dimensional function that you need a computer, you need a fast computer to render these things that you could sort of fly through, and it would have these most beautiful alien, otherworldly shapes and places that for me were just like wow. So as a visual effects artist, I started exploring how to create these sort of things, and I came upon this piece of software called Mandelbulb 3D, which is a piece of software that anyone can download for free on the internet. And if you have a fast computer, you need a reasonably fast computer with a lot of CPU. You can actually make your own fractals, three-dimensional fractals. You take formulas together, you have no idea what they mean because they have weird names like amazing box or amazing surface, or lots of other mathematical names, Sierpinski, um, integer power things, and you combine them, and there's this sort of intuitive interface where you can see the kind of weird looking alien worlds that it creates. So I started playing around with that, and I was like, this is really an art form by itself. I feel a little bit like I would say like a documentary maker or a cinematographer for a nature show for Discovery Channel. Um, I'm just going exploring the fractal wilderness. It's like all virtual, of course, but it really feels like these kind of places exist. And I take my virtual camera and I show it um, to my audience using all sorts of tricks that I learned from film, things like editing, lighting, pacing, camera, sound design, and all that sort of stuff. So the film you're going to see is called Emergence, where I do explore the various fractals, and I also explore the very different fractals that you have, the sort of more geometric fractals, and you have the very organic looking fractals. And the geometric fractals, uh, they have sort of straight lines, but they look sometimes like temples or churches. They look like walls with beautiful arches, and the archways have a certain dimension that sort of makes sense because it's in the golden ratio, and all these sort of fractal principles apply. And then you have the natural world where these temples are, and they can look like gardens, they can look like deserts, they can look like um, very interesting things. And this film plays with those two different kind of fractals. But I think it's interesting if you watch it to keep in mind that none of this is designed. It's not that you start with, oh, this would be cool, and then you start sculpting or building it like a regular 3D process would be, or any kind of filmmaking process would be. This is really stuff that is not designed, but it's found. It's explored, and it sort of exists in a mathematical reality. And all I'm doing is just bringing it out and showing it to you. And I think that makes it very fascinating. And even knowing that all that detail can come from a very tiny formula, that a really tiny formula is actually responsible for creating all that detail that you're about to see. I think that's, for me, that's just a fascinating thing, and that's why I keep creating fractals. So I hope you enjoy it. My name is Julius Horsthuis. Thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed Emergence. Something both Alex and Julius touched upon is their fascination with and aesthetic attraction to fractals. Up next, we'll hear from Kelly Robles, who may be able to help us understand the why of humans' attraction to fractals. In her talk, she'll dig into naturally occurring fractals, the way they help create order out of chaos, and how humans perceive them. Kelly Robles, MS, is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Oregon in the Department of Psychology, where she studies fractals. She is the lead author of the recently released article, A Shared Fractal Aesthetic Across Development, which appeared in the November 2020 publication of Nature. After we hear from Kelly, we'll close out this program with one more short from Julius Horsthuis called Our Fractal Brains. Please enjoy.
Thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Kelly Robles. I'm a graduate researcher at the University of Oregon. I primarily study visual perception, how our visual system interprets the very noisy world around us. And in particular, I focus on visual fractal patterns. So today we'll be talking about fractals, finding order in natural chaos. So what is a fractal? A fractal is a self-similar pattern that repeats at an increasingly fine scale in either an exact or a statistical manner. Below, we have two really nice photos of fractals, the top one being more human-generated on a computer, and this bottom one being more of a naturally occurring fractal pattern. On that top image, you see that little zigzag that's circled in blue. As that zigzag pattern is repeated over and over again at different angles across the screen, you see it forms into this much more global pattern that has these self-repeating small zigzag components. Then when we look at that bottom image of a very commonly occurring fractal pattern, we see that it's a tree branch. When you look at an overall big tree branch, you see the twists and turns, the forking branches and smaller offshoots that occur all throughout the tree. But then if you zoom in and look at just a section of that large tree branch, so looking at a smaller offshoot branch, you start to see these similar, same repeating twists and turns from that overall global object. Even at that third scale that you zoom in, you still see the reminiscent twists and turns of the overall tree's pattern. So both of these are really great examples of human-made as well as naturally occurring fractal patterns. Fractals themselves can vary in both symmetry as well as recursion. Symmetry are going to be those two items on the left. So that same fractal pattern that we just looked at, as well as this more snowflakey looking pattern. Both of those have different amounts of symmetry to them. The image on the right has a lot of symmetry, both across the horizontal as well as vertical axis, while that first image does not possess those same properties. We also deal with differences in recursion. Recursion just means the number of repetitions of that base component, image, or pattern across the scales of the pattern as a whole. So you see this nice little checker pattern. Think of it as an offshoot from that center square in the first orange image. And then when you look at the one next to it, you see that that same basic pattern is repeated at another degree. So you would say that that one has another level of recursion than the first orange image. Fractals also vary in complexity. Fractal patterns in this visual sense exist between Euclidean dimensions 1 and 2. Euclidean dimension 1 is in reference to a line, just a straight line on its own, and Euclidean dimension 2 is going to be referencing a full surface. So you can see in this diagram below, fractal patterns ranging from 1.1 to 1.9, so staying just within those boundaries. Fractals also differ based on their exact or statistical nature of repetition. We also consider statistical repetition to be more of a natural repetition. These are things that you're going to be seeing throughout nature. This is going to be your tree branches, your coastlines, things like that. As you can see below, we have two patterns of an exact nature. So back to that kind of snowflake looking pattern. And then next to it are going to be called H trees, or just H's branching out of one big H in the middle. Next to those two, we have two examples of our statistical pattern fractals, which resemble something like coastlines or cloud patterns. So we've gotten a little bit into what are fractals. Now, where can we find fractals? Well, with the chaotic world around us, we can always find some form of order. Both nature-made order that go everything from down at this quark level with regards to physics, these basic building parts, building blocks, components of our universe, up through a microscopic level, up to an atmospheric level, and even up into the cosmos, we still are finding these self-repeating patterns. But fractals are not only nature-made, they're also human-made. Fractals span architecture of multiple cultures and multiple time periods, as well as famous artworks and things that we consider to be really aesthetically pleasing. So we have works over here from M.C. Escher, we have Jackson Pollock splatter paintings, and we have mosaic tiles in general, all resemble these very important fractal properties. So we've gone over fractal patterns, what they are, where we can find them, but how do they then impact human behavior? Well, fractals are found everywhere in our natural world, and in our natural world, they span from very low complexity all the way up to very high complexity. So the most common fractal pattern that we encounter with our naked eye is going to be a low moderate complexity. So not too simple, yet definitely not very complex as well. We consider this to be a D value on that 1 to 2 scale of 1.3 or 1.4. Now, these 1.3, 1.4 items are all throughout the world. So we're looking at leaves, we're looking at plants, we're looking at branches of trees, cloud formations. We're also seeing whole environments that are going to be fractal in nature and existing at that low moderate complexity. If you look at the savanna picture that's to the right, this is a perfect example of this low moderate complexity fractal environment. And it's really interesting to look at the fact that our ancestral home as humans, being the savanna, is this 1.3, 1.4 complexity, this low moderate complexity that is so prevalent throughout the rest of our natural world as well. And this itself leads me into fractal fluency theory. So fractal fluency theory states that we have a more fluent visual processing for fractal patterns, and especially fractal patterns at this low to moderate spatial frequency. So it would make sense that we would be able to best process these patterns because of a need for visual efficiency. Why is it that we would look at something that we see every day, all the time, and want to devote all of our attentional resources to it, all of our processing power to it? So instead, the visual system itself is tuned to be able to best process these patterns that we encounter and every day and are bombarded by if we had to truly focus on them in each pattern, in each twist and turn. Because of this, we're able to then use our energy to focus to process images that are less common to us in our visual world. So more novel objects, more novel environments, things that are less typical are things that we need to pay more attention to, as opposed to our very common background and very common objects. So fractal fluency not only affects our speed of processing or the efficiency in which we're processing the visual world around us, but it also then changes human performance on activities. So if you're navigating a fractal environment, you find that at that low moderate 1.3 dimension, we are the best at navigating and finding a target. Also, if you're looking at these kind of noisy patterns that fractals are out in the world, so think of cloud gazing or looking at bushes and things, you start to see that patterns at this 1.3, that low moderate complexity D value, you start to be able to picture more objects in this noise. And this is a reflection of pareidolia, which is the ability to find objects or images in seemingly noisy or random patterns. So at this low, moderate 1.3 complexity, you actually are able to identify the most objects that are seemingly hidden in random patterns. Because we're best able to process these low, moderate visual complexity patterns, it also changes our aesthetic preference for these images. So fractals in general, I've shown you, have been used in lots of different art forms, but we as humans also have a preference for these fractal patterns, even out of that context. When we look at fractals of a statistical or natural repetition, as well as an exact repetition, we get very consistent findings in adults about what our preferences are. So for that top image, that statistical pattern, we really do love that low, moderate 1.3 complexity. So what we see most often in nature. When we then look at the lower image, that exact fractal, we do like a much higher intensity or much higher complexity image. And we think that that's due to the fact that unlike the fractal patterns that we find throughout nature, we get a lot of symmetry, we get this exact repetition across the scales that nature doesn't really implement. Remember, out in nature, you're not seeing these perfectly straight lines, perfectly equal triangles and such. So to have that in an image itself is very much a human-made thing. Because of that, we're better able to process that image as a whole because we can very quickly understand the smallest components of the image due to their exact nature and their symmetry across repetitions. So when we look at adults, we get that peak at 1.3 and it drops off to the sides. Then when we look at adult preference for exact fractals, it just keeps ramping up with further complexity. So how is it that we've developed this sort of fractal fluency, this ability to process fractal patterns that we experience all the time? Well, it could be due to something such as having decades of experience seeing tree branches and leaves and the natural world around us. That could be shown by a lot of the studies that are out at the moment, because the vast majority of research studies that we do for fractals and studies in general are completed on participants from a college population. So they all have roughly 20 years of experience seeing the natural world around them. To get at the possibility that experience could change our preference for these fractal patterns, we went ahead and looked at a younger population. So in my study, I looked at children between the ages of 3 and 10 years old to determine what their preferences were for fractal patterns. And children at this age, you have to remember, have spent the majority, especially at 3 years old, have spent the majority of their lives inside. They aren't going outside all day long. They spend most of their time in a Euclidean space with straight lines, not a lot of curves, and not that repetition of patterns in their visual world. When we look at the preference patterns for children from 3 to 10 years old, we see that there's no difference between 3 years old all the way to 10 years old. These preferences are set. Not only that, but we also find that they have the same preferences as adults, which is wild, because how many things can you think of that are the same in a 3-year-old and a 23-year-old? So once again, if you look to the right, you see this beautiful graph that's showing the preference for these statistical or natural patterns peaking at that low, moderate complexity, and exact patterns are going to peak at this much higher complexity because we can tolerate the differences since they're so easily broken down because of exact repetition and symmetry. Because we see that both 3 years old children and 23-year-old adults have these same preferences, we can be pretty confident in the fact that this fractal fluency is not solely just a product of years of exposure to fractal patterns. We do know that the visual system is tuned by 3 years old to be able to best process these low moderate complexity patterns. And this is done even before going to school or having that very standard coming into the world, experiencing specific things, looking at trees, doing these different activities with nature. So because of all of this, we can be confident that fractal fluency is pointing towards an earlier tuning of the visual system. So either as the visual system itself is truly coming online after birth, or if it's going to be something that could even be set in process by an evolutionary mechanism, kind of pointing back to that savanna scene that we saw beforehand of that low moderate complexity that our ancestors were inhabiting. So you've seen by your 3rd birthday that you're able to process these very common spatial frequencies around you. Because of that, you're able to very efficiently process other patterns that are of this low moderate complexity. And in general, it allows us to prevent being overwhelmed by the consistent onslaught of visual information that's always being brought in by our eyes. No matter where you look around you in the world, there's going to be visual information coming at you of different spatial complexities. Because of that, you want to be able to filter out which ones you already understand and which ones you need to put extra attention or effort into comprehending and interacting with. We see that more fluent processing leads to changes in human performance. So our performance on different tasks are very much so affected by the way that we process the visual information that we're taking in at that moment. And we find that we get better performance on tasks that require the pattern to be comprehended and then kind of ignored. So if the pattern is at that low moderate fractal complexity, that D of 1.3 or 1.4, we're best able to see it, comprehend it, and then move past it to focus on the task at hand. This allows us to balance out the information from either an overly simplistic environment or an overly complex environment to find the perfect balance that allows us to understand our background, understand objects in front of us, but then divert attention to whatever's most important for our task at hand. We've also seen that fractal fluency plays a role in attention restoration itself. This would allow us to best perform on tasks that require our full attention without being distracted by either background information or by trying to look for very simplistic, small details that might not be helpful for the task at hand. And in general, fractal fluency theory allows us to know what someone's aesthetic preference is going to be in a given situation or environment. So if these patterns themselves are so easily processed, especially at that low moderate complexity, that it's done so at almost an unconscious level, why should we care about them? Well, fractals in general, because they're everywhere, do have this profound effect on us without us even thinking about it. Even having fractal installations into the environments that we typically inhabit can greatly impact how we feel and how we interact with the space around us. This is definitely broken down into 2 very important realms, both in a commercial application as well as with regards to health outcomes. For commercial application, we're looking at how we could actually control and manipulate somebody's aesthetic experience of the environment around them. This is something that could be utilized very heavily in both business and art or architecture. You can determine how long someone's going to congregate in a space depending on how much they enjoy the space around them. If the space is too visually complex, could be too stressful, could lead them to want to leave. If the space is too boring, also could lead them to wanting to leave. But you can apply this to spaces you want people to congregate, to items you want to sell to the market. And in general, just with regards to art, what do you think people would appreciate? What do you think they would buy? What do you think that they would value? Aside from that, we also have health outcomes. So we cannot escape the visual world around us if we're still using our eyes. And at this moment in time, humans themselves are more so than ever inside. We are surrounding ourselves with Euclidean visual stimuli. We are not embracing all of the fractal patterns that we could be if we were out in nature. In general, these unnatural spatial frequencies can have impacts on our health with regards to visual strain in more Euclidean environments, or environments that are of very high complexity or even at a very low complexity, can cause visual strain for us, which then leads to higher rates of headaches, migraines, in general, not a good sense of well-being. These environments that are very devoid of nature and natural patterns also can lead to higher rates of self-reported stress and also higher rates of cardiovascular stress. And we also see that fractal patterns can help us to find focus in this Euclidean human-made environment. So by having these fractal patterns, we're able to have this disinterested interest in what's going on around us and not be too overwhelmed by any particular stimuli that we're encountering. I'd like to thank the Exploratorium for bringing me into this series today, and for you all listening to all of my research and letting me share this very fun topic of fractals with you. Thank you.